We can forgive a man for making a useful thing, as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that he admires it intensely. All art is quite useless.
A message is only as effective as the way you frame it. Melissa Raffoni puts this nicely in a 2009 article in the Harvard Business Review. She writes, "A physical frame focuses attention on the painting it surrounds. Different frames draw out different aspects of the work. How someone frames an issue influences how others see it and focuses their attention on particular aspects of it. Framing is the essence of targeting a communication to a specific audience." As a corporate consultant, Ms. Raffoni is speaking about effective management techniques, but the same could be said of stories. Throughout recorded history, storytellers have experimented with a variety of methods for framing their tales. The most popular technique is no doubt the nested narrative. The basic formulation for the nested narrative is that characters within a framing story relate the central narrative to another character. They may be telling or reading tales they've encountered, as in The 1001 Nights, Ovid's Metamorphoses, The Canterbury Tales, and The Princess Bride. They may be reflecting on events from their past, as in Wuthering Heights, The Turn of the Screw, Amadeus, Titanic, and Forrest Gump. The narratives may even be nested to more than one layer, a story within a story within a story, and so on, as in Joseph Conrad's short novel Heart of Darkness. They may even feature more Byzantine nesting designs, as in David Mitchell's not-short novel Cloud Atlas. Sometimes, as in Patrick Rothfuss's The Kingkiller Chronicle, a framing device leads to an impossible narrative. The briskly narrated audio version of the second installment in the series devotes over 30 hours to a part of the tale that was supposed to be delivered in a single day. Other times, as in The Shawshank Redemption and the Stephen King novella from which it was adapted, we don't find out the exact relationship between the framing story and the central narrative until late in the game, when the two streams merge and the integration of the framing narrative with the central narrative becomes critical to the story's culmination. The story within a story is not, of course, the only way to frame a narrative. Stephen Belber's 1999 play Tape is a blistering 90-minute drama about the lingering effects of sexual assault and the lengths to which people will sometimes go in order to settle a score. The play takes place in real time, featuring 3 characters in a single scene, on a single set, a cheap motel room. It is, in other words, tailor-made for low-budget university and semi-professional productions. Seeing the drama's minimalistic virtues, independent filmmaker Richard Linklater decided to use the script as the basis for an experiment in stripped-down digital filmmaking. He shot an almost unaltered version of the play script on location in a cheap motel room with natural lighting and only 3 actors. Rather few for a feature film. Granted, those actors were Ethan Hawke, Robert Sean Leonard, and Uma Thurman, so it wasn't exactly modest with respect to casting, but still. The film remains an exercise in simplicity. Apart from a range of camera angles and carefully modulated performances from the 3 stars, there are not a lot of cinematic flourishes in the film. It's about as simple and direct an adaptation as they come. After watching the film, however, you might be surprised to learn, as I was, that the script of the play features an optional prologue and epilogue that are left out of the cinematic version. An ironic detail, since it's indicated in the script that the prologue and epilogue are to be filmed and projected onto the wall of the theater, or a screen, I suppose. If the production decides to incorporate them at all, as I said, they're optional. Why would Richard Linklater, who is obviously far more capable of filming the scenes than most small-time theater producers, have left these scenes out? Well, one reason might be simple believability. During the main action, the characters are 10 years out of high school. The prologue occurs 10 years earlier, during their senior year, just before the incident that forms the crux of the drama took place. The 3 stars of the film were all in their early 30s when the film was produced, so it might have been a hard sell, or at least diminish the film's abundant sense of verisimilitude, to try to portray them as high school seniors. But there may have been a deeper reason. Linklater may have judged that including the prologue and epilogue would weigh the story down, that it would diminish this pithy little drama's chest-punch impact and startling immediacy. For my part, supposing this was what Richard Linklater was thinking, I think he was right. I've read the script of tape many times, including the prologue and epilogue, and while I'm glad to know that the framing device exists, I can't help thinking that it would diminish the experience to include these bits in the performance. In art, as in life, some things are better left unsaid. The playwright seems to have had a similar sense, given that he left the framing device optional. He didn't have to do that. He could have mandated that productions include the prologue and epilogue and refused to grant the rights if they didn't. There's almost a sense in his equivocation that he knows the story might be better off unburdened by these narrative extensions. It's a question that storytellers dating back at least to Homer have faced. To frame or not to frame? Will this structural addition contribute to the story's effect or unduly burden it? Will it elevate the material and make it more accessible to an audience? Or will it be a ponderous conceit that distances us from the story? Of course, we could say that every story is framed in some way, whether we realize it or not. Even a narrative that picks up in media res, that is, right in the middle of things, is framed by the unseen events that implicitly precipitated the action, and by the implications of the story's refusal to include or to comment on those events. Even a narrative as stark and seemingly circumstanceless as, say, a Samuel Beckett play is bounded by the negative space surrounding the events on stage. The void, the vacuum, is itself the frame. But the question is always available to an artist, and sometimes it's rather pressing, whether they ought to leave the mounting in the unseen negative space or bring it forward. When they are doing what they are supposed to do, framing devices invite us in. They provide an entry point, a reference, allowing the reader or listener or viewer to approach the story from a point of view that is clear to them. But what happens when a framing device doesn't do what it's supposed to do? What happens when a frame gets out of control? When the framing story grows longer than the central narrative, or the narrator refuses to respect their place in the story? What happens when the frame takes over? I'm Greg Bean, and this is Quite Useless. Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. Each episode, I take a look at a different topic in the arts, examining how it both reflects and shapes our perceptions of the world.
I love Sarah Charles. It was mine. That love. You are what you love, not what loves you. That's what I decided a long time ago.
1999 was shaping up to be a tough year for Charlie Kaufman. On the surface, things seemed to be going great. At 40 years old, after spending close to a decade working as a staff writer on a string of marginally successful TV shows, the off-kilter screenwriter was finally getting some serious attention. Production was going well on his first feature film, Being John Malkovich, and the buzz surrounding the conceptual comedy was strong enough that his agent had pulled in offers for a slew of lucrative commissions. Everyone who held the rights to a hit book was eager to see how this mad comic genius might adapt their material. The trouble was, of all the projects that had landed on Kaufman's desk, all the novels and memoirs with perfectly structured 3-act plot lines just screaming to be made into movies, with all of these softballs lobbed his way, promising not only a payday such as he had never seen, but also to secure his position as a bankable screenwriter, Kaufman had settled on the project, the one project that seemed the most unlikely. A book that would be difficult, if not impossible, to adapt to the screen. The nonfiction book, The Orchid Thief, by Susan Orlean. The Orchid Thief is a poetic meditation on passion, evolution, and an individual's struggle with society. The figure of the title, a rogue botanist named John LaRoche, is a voluble and somewhat volatile character, and Orlean evokes his person and his work with a distinctive voice. Oh, that sounds great, right? The trouble was, the book has no plot. It is an evocation, a meditation, and examination. The author devotes a great number of pages to describing the taxonomy of flowers and the history of orchid cultivation, but precious few to developing the kind of character and conflict-driven narrative that undergirds most Hollywood films. Several months into his commission, production humming on Being John Malkovich, a first draft of the adaptation of The Orchid Thief passed due, Charlie Kaufman was in despair. After 5 months of false starts, unable to gain any ground on the script, he had fallen into a deep depression. What the hell was he supposed to do? It was from this low place that an idea came to him, the only idea that seemed like it might stick. The lone thin rope dangling down, promising to let him pull himself up out of the pit he'd fallen into. Rather than writing an adaptation of The Orchid Thief, he would write a script about his inability to write an adaptation of The Orchid Thief. What emerged is one of the most original, ironic, meta-cinematic movies in the history of film. Beginning at the literal beginning of life on the planet Earth and bringing in a fictional twin brother, Donald Kaufman,
You are what you love, not what loves you.
who is credited as a co-screenwriter and to this day remains the only fictional person nominated for an Academy Award. As far as we know, I've never seen Johnny Depp in person, and I wouldn't be surprised. He also throws into the mix imagined versions of a number of real-life characters like Robert McKee, whose imputations serve as a rebuff to the conceits the screenwriter himself is using.
Sir, what if a writer is attempting to create a story where nothing much happens, where people don't change, they don't have any epiphanies, they struggle and are frustrated and nothing is resolved? More a reflection of the real world.
The real world?
Yes, sir.
The real fucking world. Nothing happens in the world? Are you out of your fucking mind? People are murdered every day. There's genocide, war, corruption. Every fucking day, somewhere in the world, somebody sacrifices his life to save somebody else. Every fucking day, someone somewhere takes a conscious decision to destroy someone else. People find love, people lose it. For Christ's sake, a child watches a mother beaten to death on the steps of a church. Someone goes hungry. Somebody else betrays his best friend for a woman. If you can't find that stuff in life, then you, my friend, don't know crap about life. And why the fuck are you wasting my 2 precious hours with your movie? I don't have any use for it. I don't have any bloody use for it.
And it doesn't stop there. The script goes so far as to distort the content of The Orchid Thief by turning the author of the book, Susan Orlean, and its subject, John LaRoche, into lovers, and having them embroiled in a drug trafficking scandal that culminates in a ludicrous action sequence that brings together the framing narrative and the ostensible central narrative. In other words, Charlie Kaufman created a fantastical framing narrative that wholly subsumed the material he was framing. The film subverts the material it is putatively based on by making the framing material the central focus of the film. Indeed, the framing device runs amok so wildly that it ends up framing itself, as we witness Kaufman, the character, conceiving of the frame he will ultimately use.
That's what I need to do. Tie all of history together.
Start right before life begins on the planet. All is lifeless. And then, life begins. With organisms. Those little single-cell ones. Oh, and it's before sex, because, everything was asexual. From there, we go to bigger things. Jellyfish. And then that fish that got legs on it and crawled out onto land, and then we see, dinosaurs. And then they're around for a long, long time. And then an asteroid comes and
And I haven't even mentioned yet that Kaufman called the film Adaptation, a title that draws attention to the screenplay's conceits. So, the script frames itself, as well as the text it is ostensibly adapting, to mind-bending results. As A.O. Scott puts it in his review of the film for the New York Times, Adaptation is, most obviously, a movie about itself, as gleefully self-referential an exercise in auto-deconstruction as you could wish, but it is also, more deeply, a movie about its own non-existence, a narrative that confronts both the impossibility and the desperate necessity of storytelling, and that short-circuits our expectations of coherence, plausibility, and fidelity to lived reality even as it satisfies them. Common sense, Scott tells us, suggests that there could never be such a movie. And Kaufman created this impossible movie, seemingly, because the material he was drawing from was impossible to adapt on its own terms, even for a mind as innovative as his own. As innovative and as cognizant of the realities of Hollywood filmmaking, cognizant enough that he was able to create such a penetrating satire of the form, which is, as much as anything, what this film is, a satire. It was also for Kaufman, ironically, an ethical consideration. While at first blush it may seem that his principal obligation is to honor the source material, not to mention its author, by, say, not portraying her as a drug and sex-addled murderer, Kaufman felt that he needed to be honest. When I was writing adaptation, he tells us, one of the main reasons I got stuck, and one of the main reasons I included myself in it, was because I was in a position that felt enormously unethical to me, because I was putting words into real people's mouths, and I didn't know how to do that. I'm not going to say Susan Orlean said this, and I'm not going to say that she had this happen to her when she didn't. So I came up with the idea that the only way that I can frame this is to say that I'm saying that she said this. This is clearly a fiction. And then I felt comfortable saying whatever I wanted, that she was a murderer. It was not, however, an easy path to set out on. Rather than feeling liberated by the decision to put himself into the movie, Kaufman remained racked by doubt and anxiety over what he was doing. It seemed like the ultimate risk, he says, to put myself out there. I mean, I was waking up every morning freaking out. I thought my career was over. And it almost was. Ed Saxon, who held the rights to The Orchid Thief and had commissioned Kaufman, was irate when he first read a draft of the script. He came, however, to appreciate its creative audacity and the courage of its author in presenting himself in such an unflattering light. When he was discussing the script with Susan Orlean, the author of The Orchid Thief, Saxon reportedly told her, "Look at Charlie. Charlie is masturbating through the whole movie using his name." For her part, Orlean seems to have been hip to this view of things. After some initial shock when she first read the script, she got on board pretty quickly. She eventually wrote this about the film: "Truth is not what is, but what we think about what is. We who were portrayed realized from scratch that none of us were in any real sense actually in the film. Kaufman was after something else, not fact, not us. The guiding impulse in Kaufman values freedom over restraint, the unusual over the usual. He wants to push the cinema against the grain into hidden humanity, to take it through the frayed synapses of the mind, complete with spiraling free associations and compulsive self-critical repetitions. For at the heart of Kaufman is that dreaded voice of authority, his artist's conscience telling him that, like it or not, one way or another, he has to tell the story." Meryl Streep, who plays Orlean in the movie, said of Kaufman, "He really writes out of pain, and he is willing to express that. It's very ambitious and very brave." Elsewhere, in praising Kaufman's accomplishment with the script, Orlean referred to the ongoing, exasperating battle between doing what is easy and doing what is good. Charlie Kaufman isn't the first person to argue that filmmakers are sometimes obliged to violate the work they're adapting in order to do the film justice. François Truffaut, who along with his colleagues at the mid-20th century film journal Cahiers du Cinéma, was largely responsible for giving us the modern conception of the auteur film director, the prevailing paradigm in movies for over half a century, makes this claim central to his idea of the filmmaker as a genuine artist. Truffaut distinguishes between a filmmaker who is simply a metteur en scène, or the setter of the scene, and one who is truly an auteur, or the author of the film. As he argues in his seminal, if somewhat confusing, essay A Certain Tendency of French Cinema, it is not only acceptable, it is imperative that the filmmaker honor their own vision for the material, rather than slavishly translating the intention of the author of the source material into the language of film. 3 years later, Truffaut wrote, "The film of tomorrow appears to me as even more personal than an individual and autobiographical novel, like a confession or a diary." Of course, Truffaut is referring to film's directors, but the concept applies just as well to a screenwriter like Charlie Kaufman. The question remains, however, why, oh why, would Kaufman have chosen The Orchid Thief to adapt in the first place? If he had such compunctions about putting words in real people's mouths, why didn't he accept a commission to adapt a piece of fiction? Then he wouldn't have had to worry about the ethical implications of the way he was treating the characters. He could have written freely, unburdened by doubt. According to Kaufman himself, it had to do with the book's appealing to his own somewhat out-of-the-mainstream sensibility. He has said that all the projects he was offered at the time were the same, except for this one. This book was different. Kaufman didn't want to churn out the same formulaic scripts as every other nameless pen-for-hire in Hollywood. Of course, if you've ever seen one of Kaufman's films, you know there was never really any risk of that. He seems almost constitutionally incapable of writing anything conventional. A few years after adaptation, he was asked to write a horror script. He responded by writing about what scares him: aging, alienation from our loved ones, falling into oneself and losing touch, the prospect of being forgotten, our endless slip-sliding away that is confirmed by death. This would become his directorial debut, Synecdoche, New York. Not a horror movie in any recognizable sense, the movie is a surreal Dostoevskian meditation on life, identity, responsibility, and mortality, all inspired by the simple prompt to write a horror film. So again, why The Orchid Thief, when it seems like he could have drawn ample inspiration for his singular vision from a fictional source? Perhaps he wanted to vex himself. Perhaps the frustration is part of the creative process. He needs something to butt up against in order to spur himself on. Or perhaps Kaufman is being a bit cagey, even a bit disingenuous in his accounts of his process with the film. He, along with the film's director Spike Jonze and its star Nicolas Cage, tended to be evasive in promotional interviews leading up to the movie's release, as one might expect since they were fielding questions about a non-existent co-author. Perhaps, however, the subterfuge ran deeper and started earlier than Kaufman and his collaborators would have it. Perhaps the idea to make the script about himself was not actually an innovation that he arrived at after failing to adapt the material in a more conventional way. Perhaps this was his design from the beginning. It's not hard to imagine that Charlie Kaufman, whether consciously or subconsciously, always wanted to write a script about his own writing process. There is, after all, a recursive, solipsistic streak to most of his work, on bold display in the comically horrific Malkovich squared scene in Being John Malkovich.
Malkovich. Malkovich, Malkovich. Malkovich, Malkovich. Malkovich, Malkovich, Malkovich. Malkovich, Malkovich. Malkovich? Malkovich! Malkovich.
And running through the entirety of Synecdoche, New York, a philosophical fantasy in which a stage director spends the second half of his life literally building his own world within a massive blimp hangar. The character Caden manages bafflingly to draw other people into his feat of self-absorption, including the man he casts to play himself in his construct.
I've never worked as an actor.
Good. Tell me why you're here.
Well, I've been following you for 20 years. So I knew about this audition because I follow you. And I've learned everything about you by following you. So hire me. And you'll see who you truly are.
In hindsight, at least, it's not at all surprising that Kaufman adapted The Orchid Thief the way he did. Like Woody Allen, all of Kaufman's protagonists come across, at least partly, as versions of himself. Kaufman deflects, but doesn't outright deny this claim when he says, "The movies are me." And by that I mean I'm putting myself into the movies. It doesn't mean I'm Caden, it doesn't mean I'm any of the other characters. The feelings and the emotions and desires and neediness or whatever expressed in the movie is me trying to be very honest. And I feel like this stuff is me. And in a way I'm saying, accept me. So it may be that, for his second feature, Charlie Kaufman was determined to write about his own artistic process, driven by the guiding impulse toward freedom over restraint that Susan Orlean identifies in his work. All he needed was a plausible pretext for him to write about himself as a writer, a bit of dramatic grist. Like, say, the challenge of adapting a book that has no plot. It may be that The Orchid Thief didn't present the ultimate challenge to Kaufman's artistic prowess, but rather the perfect vessel for him to do what he was already determined to do.
This illustrates how I will move into my next vessel.
Caden's doppelganger in Synecdoche, New York, promises to show the character who he really is. If his fictional twin Donald is right, and we are what we love, not what loves us, it may be that above all else, Charlie Kaufman is thoroughly himself. If Kaufman did choose The Orchid Thief because it provides a vessel for his own creative vision rather than out of an authentic interest in the material, he wouldn't be the first filmmaker to do so. In adapting The Shining to the screen, Stanley Kubrick took the basic plot elements of the Stephen King novel and radically altered the substance of the story, infusing it with archetypal resonances that are simply not present in the book. King famously hated the results, but Kubrick doesn't seem to have minded. Even when he's praising the novel's merits, the tenor of his comments is dismissive. In an interview with Michel Simon, Kubrick says, "With The Shining, the problem was to extract the essential plot and to reinvent the sections of the story that were weak. The characters needed to be developed a bit differently than they were in the novel." While Kubrick calls the novel one of the most ingenious and exciting stories of the genre he had read, he is quick to add, "The novel is by no means a serious literary work, but the plot is for the most part extremely well worked out, and for a film that is often all that really matters." In the whole course of the interview, he does not mention The Shining's author by name. Granted, this was before Stephen King was a household name, but it's still surprisingly dismissive. The documentary feature Room 237 describes in exultant thoroughness several fan theories surrounding the film version of The Shining, ranging from an emphasis on the homoerotic elements of the film to the interpretation that it's about the Native American genocide to the surprisingly cogent argument that the movie is Kubrick's thinly veiled admission that he was hired by the U.S. government to fake the moon landing. Regardless of whether any of these theories holds water, the fact that the film can support such variegated interpretations demonstrates its complexity and its deep symbolic content. The novel, for its merits, does not invite such clever reading. One of the contributors to Room 237 points out that, in the novel, the Torrance family drives a red Volkswagen Beetle out to the Colorado hotel where they're going to spend the winter. In the film, the Beetle is yellow, an alteration that seems innocuous until you notice that, on their trek into the mountains, they pass by a red Beetle that has been crushed by a semi-truck. The contributor interprets this detail as Kubrick's statement to King that he is obliterating the author's vision and replacing it with his own. And indeed, many of the most striking images from the movie, the appearance of the twin girls, the elevator full of blood, Danny using his little finger to depict his imaginary friend Tony, and Jack chasing Danny through the hedge maze, don't even appear in the book. Kubrick also leaves out some of the book's more disappointing excesses, including a gang of haunted hedge animals and a boiler room explosion. Charlie Kaufman surrounded the material of The Orchid Thief with a frame that became the main substance of the film. Stanley Kubrick did something perhaps more perverse, if subtler. He hollowed out the novel he was adapting and replaced its guts with his own vision. Like a hermit crab stepping into a new shell, Kubrick turned the novel itself into the frame for the film he wanted to make. Or perhaps that's not quite right. There are a couple different meanings to the word frame. It can mean the structure that surrounds or encases something, like a picture frame, or it can mean the thing that holds it up, that gives it shape, like a skeleton or a scaffolding. Perhaps the latter is a better analogy for what Kubrick was up to in adapting a mediocre horror novel. He wasn't interested in the material itself. He was using the bones of the plot as a frame for his creation. As I said at the top of the previous episode, Hollywood ruins everything, right? Well, not so fast. While it may be true that the Hollywood movie machine takes source materials and excises their heart and soul, leaving only hollowed-out husks, sometimes it fills the frame with something even better. Sometimes it takes that ambulating skeleton and slaps some meat on its bones. There is nothing new under the sun. Everything is an adaptation of an adaptation of an adaptation. When adapting another work to a new medium, the artist must decide how to frame the narrative. And every creative work is adapted from something else, if not from an identifiable source, then from the million unseen influences sewn into the creative ground from which the work emerges. In the liner notes to the soundtrack for adaptation, the film's composer, Carter Burwell, writes about creation, the great process, which is always the unfolding of some earlier creation, suggesting a spinning wheel of recursion. Art is adaptation, regardless of how we choose to frame it. This episode of Quite Useless was written and produced by me, with music by my brother Mike and a couple of my own tunes as well. This episode was deeply informed by Doreen Alexander's book Charlie Kaufman, Confessions of an Original Mind, as well as articles about the screenwriter in the Austin Chronicle and RogerEbert.com. You can subscribe to Quite Useless on iTunes or Google Play or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you have a moment to drop us a rating or a review on iTunes, I will love you as unequivocally as Donald Kaufman loved Sarah Marshall. You can find all our episodes on our website, thisisquiteuseless.com. Don't hesitate to drop me a line on Facebook and Twitter, or email quiteuselesspodcast@gmail.com to tell me I need to stop making references to Stephen King. Seriously, I've mentioned him like 5 times in this season already. Maybe more. I'm Greg Beam, and I very much hope you'll join me for more, sometimes original, sometimes adapted, quite useless endeavors.